Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this 9th edition of Kendriam ESG Talks. Thank you very much for being here today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, these events have only one sole objective, is to educate you on ESG investing. It is part of the Kendriam Academy, the online platform of sustainable investing training that Kendriam launched 5 years ago. I am Laurent Sécheret. I am heading communications at Kendriam. I'm very happy to welcome you today. Today, we've picked a topic which should be of interest to any human living on planet Earth, and which is definitely on top of any investor's agenda, biodiversity. And so to educate on and discuss biodiversity in the coming hour, I am joined today with two great experts on this topic within the finance space, namely Marine de Bazelaire, here today. Marine is Group Advisor on Natural Capital at HSBC, the holding company. She's also a member of the Task Force on Natural Related Disclosure, and she will tell us a lot more about this later on. The other member of our panel today is Alix Chausson, who is a colleague of mine at Kendriam. She's an unbelievable source of knowledge and kindness on climate-related topics, including biodiversity. Welcome to you all. So let's start maybe with you, Marine. When we discussed this event, my first question to you was, what led HSBC Group to create such a role at the holding company level?
Thank you very much, Laurent, and thank you, the Kendriam team, for inviting me today. So what led HSBC to create such a role in alignment of planets? This is not a new agenda for HSBC. Actually, the sustainability strategy of HSBC started in 2004 with a risk policy dedicated to forests and product derived by forest. Being said that, a couple of years ago, HSBC committed to be net zero by 2050. And if you look at any IPCC scenario for decarbonation, all include natural carbon sinks via the so-called AFLU. And so the question I posed to our global team was, what does that mean for our portfolio? And so looking at it, we quickly understood that it was an imperative to get to net zero. There's no net zero without halting nature loss. Our existing policies were addressing part of the problem. Our policy I mentioned earlier on forest, but also on agricultural commodity, leads us to the fact that we do not finance any direct deforestation, for example. But what about the deforestation that is embedded in supply chains? And so science was showing that there's an overlap between climate and nature, but there were also specificities that were a potential threat to the global economy. I mean, loss of pollinators, for example. So finally, we also understood that we had no clear idea on how we should embrace it all. And so here I am, after 17 years as head of sustainability for France and then Europe. I'm in charge of this new agenda for HSBC.
Great, thank you. So maybe the first thing we can do together is try to define biodiversity, because it's quite a wide topic. When we talk about climate, it seems easy. You got CO2 emissions, very easy to measure, very easy to articulate. Biodiversity, does it have a definition?
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's nice to hear that now climate is easy to define, because remember a couple of years ago, I remember when the new law article 173 came, and we were asked as financial institution to assess our exposure to climate related risk. We were like all petrified, probably in the same situation we are now with biodiversity. So let's go back to the basics. Nature, well, it's quite easy. This one, it refers to land, ocean, fresh water, and atmosphere. And so what is natural capital? Well, it consists in the stocks of nature-related assets. I mean, think of food, water, shelter, trees, animals, etc. that capital gives rise to what we call flows of benefits to people in the economy. It's also ecosystem services. And so those flows like crop pollination, water purification, carbon sequestration are an overall benefit to the economy that is estimated to be worth something like $130 trillion per year. And that's an estimation from the OECD. Well, biodiversity is what enables those ecosystem services delivered by nature to be productive, resilient, and adaptable. That's how the Dasgupta report is defining it. So biodiversity is what enables the ecosystem services to be productive, resilient, and adaptable. And we all know around this call that the difference between value and price. And so there's most of the value incurred by ecosystem services is not price in economic models. And I think that as a consequence, biodiversity is degrading at an unprecedented rate. And that poses a systemic risk to the global economy. And that's what we want to address by addressing biodiversity-related issues.
Exactly. And you just mentioned the Dasgupta review, which is, like a great source of knowledge for anyone listening to us here. I strongly encourage all of you to read that report, which is updated, I think, once a year or yeah, maybe very regularly. I just forgot to mention something. So all our audience is able to ask questions. So in order to make this event as lively as possible, don't hesitate to ask your questions in the box. I'll try to moderate with my own questions, but of course, if you have yours, it will make the event even more lively. Alex, I think we've prepared 4 slides to exactly, maybe not repeat, but put some figures and stuff on exactly what Marine just said. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go through all these 4 slides. It's just very short, but just to, really to frame what we want to address here. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, so as Marine said, I think it is without saying that we cannot live without biodiversity, without nature. And as Marine mentioned, we are continuously helped by those ecosystem services, so kind of positive externalities that have long been considered as free. Obviously, we all spontaneously think about bees, and they don't only make honey, they also make the pollination possible. And so without bees, we could not feed ourselves. And as Marine mentioned, it is very difficult to value this economic benefit. The only way at the moment, or one of the way that has been found, is when you lose an ecosystem service, and then you need to replace that by human action. So we know the example of the loss of bees in some areas, like the Sichuan, where they needed then to employ human to pollinize. And so then you can value, in a way, you can price the value that has been lost by not having any more bees that are making that possible. So as it was mentioned by Marine, we try to value really what is the global bill or the global cost or the global benefits, if you want, of biodiversity. It's quite difficult, as we said, but the number that is given is 120 or 30 or 40 trillion a year. What it means, it's 1.5 times global GDP. So that's the amount of ecosystem services that is helping us. If we look now at biodiversity loss on the next slide, we've all heard those numbers that are pretty scary and getting worse and worse every year. If you look at, I think one report that is very interesting is the Living Planet report by the WWF, which really takes stock on biodiversity loss every year. The population of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish have declined by an average of 68% in the past 40 years, something that obviously the world had never seen. 75% of land has been significantly altered by human activity. 3/4 of land on this planet has been altered by human activities. And 90%, 90, of wetland that are very crucial for climate, that are very crucial for biodiversity, 90% of wetland have been lost. You know that the trend is by no means at the moment reversing. We've seen on deforestation sometimes some year being better and then deteriorating again. The trend is deteriorating. Each year the Living Planet Index is dire and dire. According to the latest IPBES report, more than 25% of assessed animals and plant group are threatened. So we could lose in the coming year one quarter of biodiversity on this planet, or at least of units of animal and plants on this planet. Obviously, part of the reason is that we are overusing our Earth biocapacity, which means that basically the planet's ability to regenerate itself is now less and less effective. We are overusing by 56% the Earth biocapacity, and as you know, each year we can see that the day when we have used all our resources is coming sooner and sooner. So that's something that if we don't reverse, will probably bring humankind to a very, very disastrous condition. And what is really central to biodiversity, but also to the way we use nature, to the way we interact with nature, as you know, is the notion of planet boundaries. So there are planet boundaries, so in the Earth's ability to regenerate, and we need to stay within those planet boundaries. And as you know, we have passed, and very recently we passed another one on fresh water. When we look at the key drivers of biodiversity loss on this slide, the main driver really, and I don't think it will come as a surprise, is land and sea use change due to land conversion, to degradation, to deforestation, to the modification of ecosystem, and that's by quite a big number. That's really the main cause of diversity. So yes, artificialization of soil, the conversion of wide areas into economic activities. So basically, human activities and how they impact really the way the planet operates. The second main driver is the overexploitation of animals, fish, trees, plants. So basically, it's mostly linked to the way we feed ourselves. So because we are deforesting some very important forests, like the Amazonia, but there are other as well, to basically have to breed some cattle. That's then a very massive driver for biodiversity loss. The third one, and it has been mentioned by Marine, and it's very important to keep that in mind, is climate change. Climate change and biodiversity are very much linked. Changing ecosystems permanently. So because of climate change, obviously ecosystems are changing. Not only the temperature, the way, and some areas are changing permanently. And in many cases, it leads to a loss of biodiversity. We all have in mind, for example, the loss of permafrost in the Arctic, and the fact that probably the Arctic region will be ice-free at some point, hopefully the later possible, but we are going in that kind of trend. The fourth driver is pollution. Again, here we think about soil pollution, water pollution, air pollution as well, that has a massive impact on biodiversity. And the fifth one is around invasive species and disease. It's a driver that is growing quite rapidly. You've seen, like me, the outbreak of avian flu, for example. And so the fact that disease between animals is spreading more and more rapidly, and the fact that obviously it threatens the biodiversity, but also our ability to feed ourselves. If there is one sector that is very central to biodiversity as the sector that is generating the most impact on biodiversity, but also that is the most dependent on biodiversity. You know that when we analyze biodiversity, we look at impacts and we also look at dependency. So those are two the two faces of biodiversity. It's really the food sector. So the way we feed ourselves is what has the most impact on biodiversity, and this is the sector that is the most dependent on biodiversity. Agriculture accounts for about 40 to 50%, so half of the impact on biodiversity. And it also accounts for 3/4 of all deforestation and land conversion. And obviously, this is something that is growing rapidly and that is becoming worse and worse. You have as well other number that just give you an idea of the impact of food, of the agriculture sector on biodiversity here. I think those numbers really speak for themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we know that what we're talking about. And if we try to take biodiversity from the investment angle or the financing angle, so we immediately feel that the risk for investors, the risk for financial institutions. Marine, can you summarize for us the key risks financial institutions are facing when thinking about biodiversity?
Yes, and it leads me to come back to the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure that you mentioned earlier, which is actually helping us all, being it corporates and also financial institutions, to define the terms around nature-related risks and opportunities. And the TNFD defines nature-related risks as the potential threats posed to an organization linked to its impact and dependencies on nature, as Alex mentioned earlier. And they can please be split into three kind of risks, and you will recall what TCFD has done in its own time. So physical, transition, and systemic risk. Physical risk comes from the effects of loss of certain species or key ecosystem services on which an organization could depend. So this could be acute or chronic. When we talk about acute physical risk, you can think, for example, of pests disseminating crops. And chronic physical risk, you can think of loss of pollinators. So that's for one. On transition risk, they arise from new costs related to inevitable policy responses on nature, halting deforestation, for example, or a change in diets in canteens, for example. Systemic risks, it refers to, for example, the risk of a deterioration of one ecosystem services to another, leading to a collapse. So deterioration of one ecosystem, for example, that could be soil health, which will lead in decline in food productivity, which could lead to famine. So physical, transition, systemic risks.
Okay, thank you. And are some of these risks already felt or material for corporates, for governments, for investors as well?
Yes, I mean, those risks are definitely material. I mean, if nature is not protected, at least $10 trillion of global GDP will be lost by 2050 due to the decline of ecosystem services. So it's absolutely material. And I invite you to read a very good report that was released a couple of months ago by the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System. We've talked about the Dasgupta report, and yes, I mean, as you said, Laurent, it's a very good report on the economics behind biodiversity. Remember, the Lord Stern review on climate in 2006 was moving the climate agenda toward the economic understanding and economic impact, Well, the Dasgupta review is doing the same thing with biodiversity, I mean, shifting it into economic imperative. Well, the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, is a network of central banks working on climate and environmental issue. And for a year now, they have put a lot of thoughts around biodiversity, led by initial assessment done by several central banks in different parts of the world, the leading one being the one from the Dutch Central Bank, the Dutch National Bank, DNB. And they came up with the fact that a third of the portfolio of national banks in Netherlands are exposed to very high or high biodiversity related risks. So, for example, and that comes back to a part of that region, to give an example, remember the torrential rainfall that appeared, that devastated part of Germany last year in July 2021. Well, the cost for Germany was more than 220 lives, but also $40 billion. And it's actually the most important environmental related catastrophe that happened to Germany. Well, it's not only climate related, it comes back to the overlap that we mentioned, and to what Alex said, that the first driver of nature loss is change in land use and artificialization of soil. And it has been demonstrated that on a lot of that region, the impact were led by that artificialization of soil. There's also, and I'll stop there, another very good report that was released a couple of months ago by CISL, the Cambridge Institute on Sustainability Leadership, that measured the exposure to degraded land of listed companies in the full food supply chain in Brazil, and the difference between degraded lands and healthy soil being the differentiating factor between negative and positive market value. What they showed is that degraded land had an impact of 13% following extreme weather, while those on healthy soil increased by 6%. So it's material, it's already happening, and it needs to be tackled.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, it's good to hear that some governments are really, starting to consider nature as a capital and trying to protect it. Alex, as far as companies are concerned, you mentioned the food industry, of course, the food sector, and we understand that this sector is the one which is the impacting the most biodiversity and impacted the most by the effect on biodiversity. Have companies, and especially companies of the food sector, started to reduce their impact on biodiversity? How do you assess them from an ESG standpoint?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think most companies that are directly impacted or dependent on biodiversity have been working on their impact and trying to reduce the impact, or at least trying to secure the supply of their
I think we lost Alex.
Yeah, we lost Alex a little bit. Maybe she'll come back. Let's wait 2 seconds.
Yeah, maybe to fill the gap. Oh, no, Alex, you're back.
Alex, you're back.
Sorry. Yes, I have some connection issues.
It's okay. We just lost you for the last 30 seconds when you just started to give this amazing answer.
Okay, no, that's fine. No, I was saying most of companies have been obviously trying to manage their impact and dependency on biodiversity without talking about, biodiversity policies and biodiversity strategy. I think now the discussion is getting a little bit more structured because of those framework, because of these, let's not talk about standardization, but at least having the same way of looking at that. And if you look at, yes, okay, in the food industry, obviously, if you don't have access to good sources of water, for example, good quality of water. Basically, you have to stop operation, and we've seen example in Germany as well. I mean, looking at the chemical sector, and it's good to take example of companies that are close, of countries that are close to us. When there was this massive drought in the Rhine areas, basically all of the chemical industry had to stop because they did not have water, either for the need, also to transport their chemicals. So we are seeing that already in all sectors. But we are still seeing some companies and in some sectors that have very much, very significant impact on biodiversity that can tell us, no, we've not put in place at the moment a biodiversity policy. It does not mean that they're doing nothing, just mean that the way they are framing this topic at the moment is not around biodiversity, it's around access to water, it's around good license to operate and making sure that you don't pollute the environment and you maintain good relations with local communities. So so it would be unfair to say that companies are doing nothing or are just starting on biodiversity, because they all have are managing this issue when it's impactful. But at the same time, what we are entering this space when we need common metric, when we need common framework, and when we need to speak the same language to actually assess what are the impact, what are the dependencies. So that's a little bit the part that is missing. And so we mentioned the food sector in terms of being very impacted and also dependent on biodiversity. Obviously, extraction of raw materials is another one. So the mining sector, all the extractive industry, basically, so mining, but also oil and gas, mining, maybe more because they have more direct, let's say, impact on biodiversity. For them, managing biodiversity has always been part of operating because of this license to operate, because you need environmental permits if you want to operate, and so to secure a good relation with government and with local communities, they had to do something about biodiversity. Is it enough? It depends, really. We think that some companies could do more. We think that we don't have access to all the metrics, all the data that is helpful for us to assess those impacts. But most companies are already integrating this issue when it's impactful and when they have dependencies. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So now we've taken the risk angle, of course. Can we talk a little bit about the opportunity angle? Where does the opportunity lie today, really? You know, we can see clearly the risk, but where is the opportunity lie? Where does it lie? Is there a growing economy around biodiversity protection and restoration, about biodiversity conservation and mitigation? Is there an economy developing on that end?
I can start. Maybe Marine will have as well. It's quite good because Marine has more the kind of banking and financing angle, and I have more the investor angle. I think in the investor angle, and obviously because we are operating on capital markets, so big listed companies, it's very difficult to find companies that are fully targeted and specialized on biodiversity and really on creating positive biodiversity impact and all that. I think it's different in the private capital space, where we've seen funds and financing from investors in private equity and private debt with a very interesting project of restoration of ecosystem, of reforestation and all that. In the listed equity or corporate bond space, at the moment, it's still early stage, and I think for us, and you know, we see those claims as well of companies saying we want to be net biodiversity positive. I think we need to be very careful with that, because when we cannot measure biodiversity at the moment, when we don't have a common metric, when the common metric that we have on the investor side is not the one that is used by companies, so there is a mismatch of how we measure actually biodiversity. So when we are working really on that, I think we need to be a little bit careful on making those claims of being net positive and all that, when we should really focus on assessing and minimizing the impact at the moment. So yes, there will be opportunities. There will be opportunities in terms of minimizing the risk of restoring, of having at some point net positive impact. We just need right now more time to spend more time on standardization, on methods, on assessments, just to make sure that we can really capture all the impacts that are being created.
Yes, maybe if I can add, or maybe paraphrase you a little bit, Alix. At the end, I mean, there's great opportunities. 100% of the global economy is directly or indirectly dependent to nature. I mean, whatever you're doing at some point, I mean, you need nature to feed yourself, at least, so to work, but also to produce any kind of good. to sell any kind of good, etc. And so yes, food, drink, and agriculture is a key one. Power is a key one. Manufacturing is a key one, and then apparel is a key one too. Distribution is a key one, etc., etc. There's great opportunities for us to accompany the transition of any kind of company toward practices that respect planetary boundaries. And so most of the planetary boundaries are nature related. And so, yes, it's difficult. I completely concur with what you say, Alex, is that a nature positive claim is quite risky because ecosystems are extremely complex. And so whatever needle you move can have adverse impact that were not anticipated, but you can look at the materiality of the issue for your own operation. I mean, taking a concrete example, we've made an assessment of the impact of water curtailment on the heavy industry sector in China. And that's public. That's also published on the CISL website. And that water curtailment is a realistic scenario. It's what happened in South Africa, in Cape Town a couple of years ago. So during 3 months, no water. And no water not linked to climate change issue, but linked to a conflict in usage. You have less water, you have more need for agriculture, etc. What happened to that heavy industry sector? Well, actually, that heavy industry sector, for a third of our portfolio, the degradation in credit risk is from 2 to 4 notches, meaning it's extremely material. I mean, our team think that part of those companies, a third of our portfolio, may not recover from such a scenario over more than 18 months. So it may translate into a close down of companies unless they address those issues. And there's many ways to secure water availability for any kind of infrastructure. I mean, we see the power of afforestation well done to actually allow water retention, etc. So it's what we call nature-based solutions. So there's case by case a lot of opportunity for a company to look at their value chain, to look at their operation, and to address their impact and dependency on nature. And that's opportunities for us to finance that kind of economy.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Kroum. Thank you, Kroum, which is, could the panelists comment on double materiality and the responsibility banks and investors carry for the impact of companies and governments they invest in and finance?
Yeah, I think, well, so biodiversity can be one part of well, double materiality is really how the ESG space is being kind of a little bit framed and transformed. And basically double materiality means that as a company or as an investor, ESG issues, and here biodiversity, have impacts on your activity, but also by your activity, by your investment, you also have impact on biodiversity. So that's why we talk about the double materiality, and it means basically it's in both ways. So yeah, so I think when looking at biodiversity, it's very clear that we need to assess that in a double materiality framework, because if there is one topic where, and this is when we talk about impact and dependency, so basically you have impact on biodiversity by your activity because of, yeah, as we said, soil degradation, artificialization, deforestation, but also you're dependent on biodiversity. When you're, again, in the food sector, you're dependent on bees, you're dependent on access to water. So I think if we don't assess biodiversity in this double materiality way, and that's why actually in the methodologies to assess biodiversity, usually there are those two parts, impacts and dependency. At the moment, most of the methodologies that are the most advanced are looking more at impact. But you also have now methodology, and there is one very great database that we use as well, which is called Encore, and where you have the link and the dependency that each activity has towards in link with biodiversity. So yes, I mean, double materiality, it's transforming the ESG space, and for biodiversity, if we don't assess it taking a double materiality point of view, I think we won't be able to address this challenge at all.
Yeah, I think, and this is key to what TNFD is doing. And maybe if I can, I'm going to share one slide, which is summarizing how I'm not sure I have it right.
Yes, yes, it's great. We can see it.
And it's what Alex said. I mean, you have the company dependence to nature, and the company impacts on nature, and the impact of nature on company. And that transform into physical risk, transition risk, systemic risk, and as we started to mention, opportunities. That transmission channel will then have impact on the company action, strategy, etc. And it will have it will also impact macroeconomic issues that are very well defined to the NGFS report that I mentioned earlier, and microeconomic impact, and the CISL report that I mentioned are really into it. And that will change the financial statement and translate into financial risks and opportunities, being it market, credit, liquidity, and operational risks.
Thank you. Now, if we talk a little bit more about the financial instruments and the investment approaches and methodologies, how do we finance? You know, like, because I think that right now the level of financing of biodiversity is very little, as you probably mentioned already. So, what is the finance gap, and what kind of financial instruments are used for now to address biodiversity issues?
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, the financing gap, I mean, to meet the Paris climate agreement, the need is estimated at roughly $3 trillion per year. And today there are only 600 billion. Well, for biodiversity, the need to meet the global agreement is roughly 800 billion. And it's only 130 billion for now. So we're only filling 15% of the need for now. That's the gap. The thing is that the private sector involvement into climate and nature also varies greatly. For climate finance, it's estimated that 50% of all financing investment come from the private sector, while for biodiversity, it's 85% that comes from the public sector, meaning that for now, the private sector is quite behind, and that's where the future level is most needed and will be important to fill that gap. And I think it's important to make a distinction between, as you say, conservation and restoration. I mean, conservation will be more about meeting the 30 by 30 objective, you know, that is proposed by the future global biodiversity framework that is being discussed, well, from today in Nairobi for the last, workshop before COP15 on biodiversity that should take place later this year. The 30 by 30 target is meaning protecting 30% of land and ocean by 2030. And for this one, it's really public-led, meaning for the private sector, the opportunity will be around sovereign debt funding, for example. And the recent Belize sovereign debt is a very good one. Restoration is more about the transition from degraded nature-related assets to improved one. Financial institutions can help by expanding investment opportunities in green bonds, for example, in low interest green loans, in impact bonds and other green financial products. Last year, we've been working with ICMA to strengthen biodiversity related KPIs and it's now online, to facilitate the dialogue between corporates and financial institutions to structure that kind of proposition. In any case, it will work best, and that's where the private sector comes, if those assets generate revenue streams. So that can be agriculture production, obviously, I mean, timber production also, but also tourism, or voluntary carbon markets. I mean, we've not talked about that so far. There's a huge development and potential around high quality carbon credits, and high quality carbon credits are actually, I mean, in a nutshell, nature-based solution or nature climate solutions. And we start to see discussions and initiative around biodiversity credits too. So a lot is to be driven by value chain, as we said earlier. I mean, and sustainable supply chain financing is also an opportunity, a key part, actually, I think, in the upcoming development of that market, along with the sustainability linked bond or sustainability loan that I mentioned earlier. And maybe last, there's also opportunity around green gray infrastructure, which can deliver important ecosystem services, such as watershed or coastal protection. And actually, we see that sometimes it can be much more cost effective than gray infrastructure. I think, for example, of mangroves. But also a flagship, which is not new, is the Catskill, not project, but actually infrastructure, upstate New York. You know, they have made that assessment of developing purification, water purification plant upstate New York, because the water that was coming to New York decades ago was of very bad quality. And actually making that assessment, they understood that developing nature-related purification scheme would be much more cost-effective and would last longer, and it's actually in place now for a couple of decades.
Thank you.
If I can comment on that, just
please,
to add something.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's, I think it's very important to understand, and I think it really is within what Marine said. Market alone won't be able to solve that biodiversity crisis. Why? Because, as we mentioned, those are externalities. Those are considered as free positive externalities or negative impact, negative externalities. So those ecosystem services and impact are not taken into account by the market. So this is very central, and that's why as well Marine mentioned that actually where we see that developing at the moment is sovereign debt as well. Is we need government action, we need regulation. We need regulation to force investors and to force companies to report on their biodiversity impact and dependencies. So that's what's happening at the moment. And we also need government to provide incentives to make those projects viable. Because as we said, yes, sometimes you can have agriculture revenues, but in a lot of biodiversity projects, if you want to create a new national park or if you want to create a new protected areas, you need, if you want, especially private financing, you need to find a way to incentivize, financially speaking, those kind of projects. So what is, and it's probably even more the case than for climate, probably. So that's something that is very key to understand, is that as financial players, we won't be able to solve this crisis without the help of government in terms of regulation for us, and also in terms of incentives as citizens as well, to protect nature and to protect the planet. That's very central to this question.
Completely concur with that. I mean, Alex, to fill that financing gap, we've certainly, I mean, need that global framework for COP15 to come up with the right message and enabler for national regulation to emerge. And also we need the right incentives. I mean, there in South America, there has been a lot of countries that enforced payment for ecosystem services. And those work very well in some countries and less in others. And there's a lot to learn from the track record of those systems. I mean, we've seen in some countries, I think it was Colombia, payment for ecosystem services for planting trees. And so people would actually cut off the forest to plant trees because then they will have a revenue. And in other countries, like in Costa Rica, I mean, it's the flagship country in the world, that the payment for ecosystem services were actually very well thought and had a long-term impact on restoring and enhancing biodiversity and nature-related impact.
Okay, so we will come back on this. We still have 13 minutes, which is a lot of time, or very little. We have a lot of questions on measuring because there are lots of investors are listening to us. So I have a question for Eva. You spoke about the need for a common metric to compare impact and dependency for different companies. What are the quantitative metrics that most promising frameworks rely on? Or more generally, what are good common quantitative metrics in your opinion?
It's a key topic addressed by the TNFD, and at the end of this, at the end of this month, it's going to be like in a week from now, a new beta framework will be released to be tested by financial institutions, asset managers, and corporates. Impacts and metrics are, metrics and targets will be more detailed in that beta framework. So it's work in progress. We don't have the answer for it all. From my experience within HSBC, to assess the materiality of a loan book, for example, of nature-related issue, it's interesting to use for the dependency, the anchor database. We've done that, and we've come up with a result that is actually quite aligned with what the Dutch central bank has done, or what Rabobank has done, or what BNP Paribas has done, is that a third of our loan book is highly or very highly dependent on water-related issue, meaning that if you need to focus on something, I think there's two key themes that are water and deforestation. And then, that's on the dependency. Then on the impact, we see in France a lot of interesting initiative that is actually scoring companies on biodiversity. I think of the Global Biodiversity Score that was developed by the Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations, or the Iceberg Data Lab that is also coming up with the corporate biodiversity footprint, another initiative like that. I mean, it collates the different impact driver by sector, by geography, depending on where the real assets of those companies are. That gives you being it the anchor of being it that scoring, a good overview to start with. And then, given that there's no issue about data, there's plethora of data everywhere, but it's difficult to have the granular one. Having those two assessments helps you shortlist the materiality issue and then engage with the company to better understand what is their policy regarding that. But Alex, you may have another strategy.
No. I think it's exactly that. We use Anchor as well to assess dependencies. I think it's quite good. It's a free database. just need some data skills to integrate that in your system. So I think obviously the academic world has been working on biodiversity for longer than the private sector, so that it's good. As you mentioned, Marine, GBS, the Global Biodiversity Score, which is at the basis of more or less, because it's at the basis of Iceberg Data Lab, it's at the basis of Carbon for Finance. So that's the one that is emerging with, you know, this metric of MSA per square meter, so mean species abundance per square meter. So it can go from 0% to 100%. So 0% is the parking, if you want, 100% is really undisturbed, pristine ecosystem. So that's, I think those are really good initiatives. The only thing at the moment that I think is important to mention, and that maybe we did not mention, is first, biodiversity, contrary to climate, is a local topic. So climate, you have CO2 and CO2 emission can be, it's the same around the world, and you can relate more or less everything to CO2 emission. Biodiversity is very local. So that's why Marine mentioned asset level data. So that's something that we need. And we've been asking that from companies and asking the regulator to put obligation on that for climate physical risk, because it's exactly the same. You need asset level data. You need to know where the company operates, because obviously ecosystems are very different. You cannot just take a country. Within a country, you will have hundreds, if not thousands of ecosystems. So we need those kind of asset level data. At the moment, the methodology that are on the market, let's say they go maybe not that far at the moment as really asset level data and ecosystems. Sometimes they take country as a proxy. But if you're in Chile, for example, in the copper industry, if you are on the seashore, or if you are in the mountain, or if you're in the Atacama Desert, obviously it's not at all the same biodiversity impact, and it's not at all as well the same dependency that you have. So we need those kind of asset level data if we want as well to progress on this assessment. And the other point that is very important to keep in mind, and that is in my view an issue, is that so investors, banks, we are working on those metrics, MSA, so GBS and all that. Companies are not reporting on those metrics at the moment, meaning that we make this assessment of the exposure to dependency and of the impact without information from companies in a way, because at the moment they give granular information, they give a lot of data, but they are not using this MSA, for example, per square meter. Some companies are doing that in a pilot project with the CDC to have a more aligned set of data. But at the moment, there is a little bit of mismatch between the methodology that are on the market on the investment and banking side and what companies are doing. And very last point, sometimes it's not always good to want to have an aggregated metric and to want to explain all the impacts of a company with just one, MSA per square meter. What we want to know is what are the projects that are problematic. So having something that is aggregated and aggregating all the projects and all the operation, sometimes it's not the best way. If you want to really assess the risk and the impact, it's better to know exactly which project is problematic. And then in your engagement, in your discussion with the company, you will focus on this one project. And sometimes as well, MSA per square meter is aggregating a lot of what we call biodiversity pressure. And what you want to know is exactly what kind of pressure is the most material for this company. So it's good as well to have a disaggregated view to really look, because it's location-based and because it's pressure-based, at what are the exact topic that is that is problematic or that is significant for a company. So just food for thought for the discussion that we're having and the thinking that we're having on the biodiversity metrics.
Thank you. So we discussed a measure, which is very important for investors, and we from what you said already, Marine, the other keyword is incentive, and we feel that there is a huge opportunity for governments, like to take care of natural capital, because there's a lot of investors ready to invest, but they don't know exactly where. So, and this is a question from Nikesh here in the box. So, how can the policy change, regulation be accelerated to address the loss of biodiversity? What is the progress there? Are there some nations moving much faster than others? Yeah, do you have a good reply on this one? And I think, Marine, you already mentioned the COP15. Is it like the key moment for biodiversity this year?
Yes, it is. The ambition of the COP15 is to replicate the Paris Agreement on climate for biodiversity. So for the first time, it's not only to set an overarching ambition and targets, but also to onboard the different stakeholders, the private sector, the financial industries, etc. For the first time in the global framework, there's going to be an article on financial institutions and the mean they can have to finance the ambition of COP15, and the ambition of COP15 will be to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. Fact is that halting and reversing nature loss was already embedded in the preceding framework, I mean, in the ESG targets, and most of the ESG targets were not met. Thing is, and that's hope, is that the landscape changed a lot. Yes, we had the Paris Agreement on climate that is facilitating our direction of travel, even if there are specificities as we extensively mentioned earlier. But we also have a lot more data to actually address and assess that issue. Satellite data, a lot of methodology, etc., a lot of reporting on those issues that are much more acute than they were before. So investors have understood the risk, data is there, so it's much easier to set up regulation to embark everyone into that topic. So we need that COP15 agreement to be ratified at some point. I wouldn't say, I mean, to be agreed in 2022 and then ratified in the next year. We absolutely need to halt nature loss now, and yes, reverse by 2030. And then we need all the countries to strengthen their national strategy and action plan on biodiversity. And if you read the last press release from the G7, from the Ministry of Climate, Environment and Energy, I mean, you will see that there's a commitment, a lot of commitments around that. So we need that overarching principles. We're pretty sure that most countries will strengthen their policies around that, and that will help the economy to shift and us to accompany that shift as much as possible.
Thank you very much. I think we are short of time now. Thank you so much for your help. It was very insightful. I hope that our audience feels the same. We will share all the reports that were mentioned during this conference and the slides with our audience, with the replay, which will be sent in a few days. Thank you so much again, and speak with you soon. The next ESG Talk will be in October, and it might be on sovereign analysis. Thank you very much, and speak with you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.